How's it going, all you Jezza heads and meth heads and crack heads? We're at the very end of SWANSTEMBER. We've got Swan's 14th album, The Glowing Man. Ha, yeah, not to brag, but there I am in the executive credits, somewhere. So I have a little more of a personal connection with The Glowing Man. It's the only album so far that I've lived through, but I basically got into the band just a few weeks before the fundraiser album was announced, The Gate, and I jumped on that opportunity as soon as I could. I was so into the band that I just couldn't hold back. I had to listen to what they were doing, what kind of music they were following up To Be Kind with, and just like before, a lot of the music they were playing on this tour between albums was very improvisational. They were really deconstructing their existing songs, turning them into new ones, and this is true more than ever for The Glowing Man, to the extent where on the final album there is a section of Bring the Sun in one of these tracks. Yeah, at some point The Glowing Man used to be Bring the Sun, Cloud of Unknowing used to be The Apostate, and Draw just constantly deconstructed what they were doing live on stage, constantly forced the band into entering very new territory. And so in the final recording of this album, you get a very big sense of this improvisation, more than you do with the other two of this trilogy. There's only 8 tracks, most of them are on the longer side and on the more freeform side. Like, compared to Be Kind, which was very tight-knit in a lot of areas, The Glowing Man is just that much more soundscapey. It can get very sparse, there's a lot of breathing room, some very interesting, long, drawn-out intros and outros, and with this also came a much more kind of nuanced sound. There isn't nearly as many moments on this album that's really in your face or aggressive, the title track, for example, being the only track I could kind of see fit on To Be Kind. Overall, this album just seems to favor and emphasize its atmosphere more than these other albums. And with that atmosphere comes some of the most matured, some of the most nuanced progressions. The band has really perfected the way that they do soundscapes here, and even though it's the same length as these other two albums, it kind of feels like it blows by faster. There's a bit of a more ambient sense to a lot of these songs and you just get lost in them. Cloud of Unknowing is over 25 minutes and it just doesn't feel that way at all. Though as per usual it revolves around repetitions, it never gets to the point where you feel like it's too repetitive. The band consistently lets the song grow and breathe and just do its own thing. It feels less like a singular song and more like you're being guided through various different sonic landscapes. The mood has also really shifted here from To Be Kind. It's a lot more of a somber sound. It's a lot more restrained. Draw isn't as vocal on this album and he lets the music really speak for itself. From the opening of the very first track, you can tell that this is a much more subdued, more ambivalent project. I wouldn't call the mood that runs through this album just sad. This isn't an album that bums you out, but it definitely has these emotive undercurrents to it. It just subtly draws you in and entrances you without you really thinking about it all that much. I think for crowds similar to myself, where my favorite part about To Be Kind was just how hard-hitting it was, The Glowing Man might kind of seem like a bit of a letdown, but this isn't an album that's trying to go as hard as possible. It does at times, but it's got a much more artistic, nuanced approach that, if you ask me, is just even more ambitious, even more creative. Even if I don't personally enjoy it as much, I still respect the hell out of it. Calling this my least favorite album of this trilogy just goes to show just how strong this trilogy is. Because The Glowing Man is still its own unique beast. It does things none of the other albums do. It does have the best production. I love the use of the piano on this album. The soundscapes sound prettier than ever. This is just a very pretty sounding album. There are moments like the intro of Frankie M that just go super ethereal. Everything just feels so vast and huge. Ultimately, the only reason this sits at my least favorite of the three is because, relatively speaking, I don't feel as drawn to it as the others, but all 3 projects still really draw you in. And I also think this project suffers from the same thing that The Seer did, where there's several shorter tracks that just feel sandwiched in between. People Like Us isn't a bad song, but it feels more in the vein of My Father Will Guide Me Up a Rope to the Sky. And When Will I Return is really nice. It really adds to the general mood of this album, but it also kind of feels a little bit recycled. It starts to feel like Swans are really running into this rut where they're just kind of repeating the same kind of chants. People have pointed out that When Will I Return kind of repeats the same sort of chant that was in Bring the Sun. It's also in the same key, which is another thing that people have really highlighted, is that in the last few albums Swans have repeated the same key a lot. I can understand it from the context of knowing that a lot of these songs literally were derived from their other songs. So even though they deconstructed this previous song and really turned it into into its own unique thing, it continues to retain that key. Regardless of that fact, I don't really think that ever actually distracts from the music when you're listening to it. Because again, there's a lot of songs where it just feels like you're transitioning from one sonic landscape to the next, and if it's all in the same key, that just helps with that transition. One thing I also really have to congratulate The Glowing Man for is that it has probably my favorite song of this trilogy. The title track, The Glowing Man, I think is this era of Swans at their most fully realized. It's got one of their best progressions in a song, it's got one of the most hard-hitting climaxes, it is the most transcendental, fulfilling, just straight up rockin' song of this entire era, and I think it's a perfect way to wrap up this album. It's not the last track, but it feels like it. The actual last track, Finally Peace, is a 6-minute track, which again, for Swans standards at this point, feels really short. Finally Peace just feels like this victory lap for the band. Michael Draw just ends this massive capstone on his musical career with one of the most optimistic, life-affirming songs to come out of the band. Yeah, overall I've got a lot of love for The Glowing Man. Maybe not as much as the previous 2 albums, but I still think it's one of the most essential Swans albums. And then there came the final tour of this era, which was really the actual end for this lineup. This was the tour I was there for, this is the tour where I saw them live, and 1 year later the band released Deliquescence. This is a notable live album just like Swans Are Dead because it features several tracks that will never be on a produced studio album. The most notable of which being The Knot, which clocks in over 40 minutes. The Knot is like the ultimate final ending note of this era of the band. So just like how the sound from the To Be Kind era to the Glowing Man era just became that much more emotive and more nuanced, that continues to be the trend after the Glowing Man, and The Knot is one of their most emotive songs of this era. I remember watching this song being played live and just thinking this is the closest that this era of the band has approached the kind of sound that Soundtracks for the Blind had. That kind of mood, that kind of atmosphere just applied to the way that this era of the band makes their music, the way they handle these progressions and these repetitions. So to me, The Knot is kind of like the perfect marriage between the Glowing Man's sound and tracks like Helpless Child and The Sound. And it's also longer than a ton of typical albums. The other 2 tracks unique to Deliquescence I wouldn't really call that big of a highlight, though if I compare to a lot of the tracks that were on The Gate that would eventually end up on The Glowing Man, I didn't really feel that strongly about them either. So if we ever actually ended up seeing these tracks on a studio album, we could infer that they would have continued to work them out, they would have evolved beyond what we saw on tour, they would have used all kinds of production and studio techniques, because a lot of the time what they played live just was a skeleton of what would be on their next album. That being said, the fact that The Knot already works so well on its own just tells me that if it were to have this same studio treatment as the other songs, then it just would have been that much better. As it stands though, I'm glad that Michael Draw wanted to move on, he wanted to change everything up. This specific lineup of the band finally dissociated after 7 long years, and fast forward to right now, Michael Draw is about to put out this next album, Leaving Meaning. A lot of the intent behind pushing his music in a very new direction again is because he didn't want this kind of sound that they were doing on the last 3 albums to kind of stagnate. There were already small hints on The Glowing Man that would have probably happened if they had continued. So I guess after he had mastered this sound, he wanted to once again refresh, renew, go in completely new territory once again. And ultimately that resulted into an album that was much more collaborative in its process, bringing together all kinds of different musicians, past Swans members included. Like I'm pretty sure every member of the previous lineup still shows up here to some capacity. And yeah, I can't wait to see what it all sounds like. I can't wait to listen to Leaving Meaning when it comes out. I can't wait to talk about it. But for now, this wraps up SWANSTEMBER. I'm actually honestly surprised I was able to do this on top of all of my engineering homework. So if you excuse me, I'm gonna take a little bit of the load off. Woo! Coming next month, Minecraft. I don't know, I just want to make videos on whatever I feel like. I don't want some specific focus. I don't want it to be like, oh no, I have to do 7 more videos by the end of the month. I don't want to feel that kind of pressure. I'll probably do something like this again in November.